purposes. Okay, sounds good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bleed Blue broadcast.
Thanks for tuning into our channel, and today we have an extra special guest for you all. We're very excited to have Nick Sheedy, who is a lead genealogist for the PBS television show Finding Your Roots.
Thank you, Angela. It's so nice to be here. I live just out of Columbia Falls, just west of town, and grew up in Big Fork. I graduated from Big Fork High School in 1992. And then Big Fork was home through my college years. So I think summer of 96 was my last summer in the Flathead. And, moved around a little bit after college. Like most people
some adventures,
do.
yeah.
You could say that. I wore many hats and had some previous lives. A few years ago, 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago, we decided where do we want to land and raise our 4 boys. And so the Flathead Valley was on a short list, and we love being in Columbia Falls. It's a lot more like the rest of the valley used to be. And so we're really happy to be here and to have jobs. My wife's a clinical counselor, and I do genealogy research. But we're really thrilled and blessed to be able to work from home and live in this beautiful place.
That's wonderful. Can you tell us maybe what's one of your favorite parts about living in Columbia Falls?
The kids, I pick them up from school, and what do? We'll run down to the old Shea and ring the bell. So my 4 boys, my oldest son's going to be 10, the youngest just turned 4, and so they love ringing the bell on the old Shea. We like being able to, take off in the afternoon and go huckleberry picking up the North Fork, or take a drive up going to the Sun in the evening. Even in the summer when the tourists clear out a little bit more in the evening, we'll go up for a sunset view. And then when we put the boat in the water, we usually go up to Hungry Horse. Fewer crowds, better views, good fishing.
So not only
wait a minute, don't tell anybody that.
It's horrible fishing, guys. Please don't go. No. If you see him down there, it was a mistake. So
no views. Yeah, no fun.
Yeah.
So, but it's a great community. We really enjoy it, and our boys are all at Glacier. 3 of our boys are at Glacier Gateway Elementary, and then the youngest is still in preschool. But we're really happy with the school system here, and it's a great community.
It really is. We definitely agree. And you said that you do genealogy research, is obviously what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah.
So I guess our first question for you is, what made you interested in this genealogical research?
I think the first thing you have to have is a natural curiosity. And I was really blessed as a kid because I knew all of my grandparents. I knew some of my great-grandparents.
It's a great gift, yeah.
Yeah, and so my last great-grandparent, my granddad, George Sand, he was 2 weeks shy of 100, and I was 26. And so I had an adult relationship with a man born in 1900. But take it a step further, his grandfather died in 1927 at the age of 92 when my great-granddad was 27 years old. So I got secondhand stories from a man born in 1835.
To know that much across the centuries is amazing.
Well, he fought 7 years as a captain under Napoleon III in the Franco-Prussian Wars. So I got secondhand stories from somebody who was born almost 200 years ago.
That'd be enough for me to be interested in genealogy.
So, and that's just one example. But lots of family stories. So you get your curiosity's piqued, and you start gathering maybe some family stories. But then you really have to shift gears a little bit to get into the research. How do you go about that research? Where do you find the records? How do you put them together? And then there's a lot of analytical skills that you have to acquire if you don't have them. And so you have to hone those skills in order to connect the dots and start building family trees and figure out who your people were.
That's really amazing.
Yeah. And you apply all those skills to researching mostly celebrities on the show?
Mostly celebrities on the show. A lot of household names, movie stars, rock and roll musicians. There's a few people that they might not be household names, but they're top in their field. And so the interesting thing about that is we don't know anything about their ancestors before we book the guest. Mm-hmm. We like to have a diversity of people on the show who have diverse backgrounds, but we actually don't know exactly where these people came from, who they were, what stories we might tell. And so Finding Your Roots is unique in that we are doing serious, original primary research for every single guest for every single episode.
And what a great gift to give somebody is like that connection and history to their family that's astounding to me.
Yeah, and you see it come out, of course it's meaningful to the guest because it's their family.
Yeah.
But it's also relatable to anybody watching because family's relatable. Mm-hmm. And so when you start framing historical events and human history through the lens of family history, it becomes relatable to anybody who's had
more real to us.
Yeah, anybody who has a family. You can imagine. You can talk about the Holocaust and the horrors of the Holocaust, but when you start putting it in the context of, yes, your ancestor, your great-grandfather and his family came to America, but guess what? He had 4 brothers that decided to stay in Poland or Belarus or wherever. Guess what happened to them? And so we've been able to tell that story a number of times where it's a Holocaust story, and these people are shipped off to Treblinka or Auschwitz. We see some of those themes run through different guests that we were able to tell them these stories, but you don't have to be Jewish to imagine what that would feel like. That, you're in America, you're relatively safe, but yet your family's Copt.
Giving you some personal connection to the depth of human experience. Mm-hmm. I'd say that like people have always been people, and hearing those like intimate stories of your family of like they loved and they lived and they traveled just like we do now is really, it's beautiful. And
so, but by making it relatable, you kind of make it, you encourage empathy, and you can encourage a deeper understanding. And I think that's one reason why the show is so popular, because it's relatable.
Mm. Yeah. And try to represent a diverse group of people. But is there any kind of particular way that the production team goes about picking people to feature?
It's actually not as interesting as you might imagine. The production team makes that decision ultimately, but they'll have a wish list. We might start out with 50 people that they'd love to have on the show. But our host, Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., sometimes he'll run into somebody at a fundraiser or a gala or somebody will reach out to him occasionally. Those are usually people that already have a family mystery that they'd like to solve. But it can be as simple as Professor Gates was on a flight from Los Angeles back to New York, and he sat next to Tina Fey. And they strike up a conversation.
My dream. Yeah. My dream flight, honestly. Sitting in business class and Tina Fey's right there.
Yeah, he says, hey, you want to be on my TV show? We'll tell you about your family history, And so sometimes it's that, kind of happenstance. But ultimately, a lot of our guests are busy people. They have careers. If they're movie stars, they have a demanding schedule. Professor Gates has a demanding schedule. We have a production schedule. And it ends up being, well, who can commit to this schedule and fit it in? And, we have a Los Angeles trip. We have 5 slots open. And who can we do? And we need to have enough lead time to do all the research.
Right.
To wrap it up and do like we're doing now. You have a bit of a scripted interview, some questions here, but you don't know what I'm going to say yet. So we had to do something similar.
Right.
For the show. We have a scripted interview, but it's a one-sided script.
Yeah.
And then of course the production team has to have time at the tail end to edit all of that into the final episode that has 2, sometimes 3 guests wrapped into an hour of an episode.
So speaking of this research component that we've been talking about, what is the setup of the episode? And obviously it's like you said, 20 to 30 minutes long. And how do you begin this in-depth process of the research? Because it's a lot.
Right.
That's what I'm getting. Yeah.
Well, on the production end, we go into that interview and it ends up being a 4 to 5 hour interview.
Yeah.
In order to get 15, 20, 30 minutes worth of footage that you can craft into that. It's a documentary series, really.
Yeah.
So the production team, the people I work with, they're documentarians. It's a field of journalism, but you're producing documentaries for television. But on the research end, you go about it the same way you go about any other family history research. We send our guests a questionnaire. Who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? Who are your great-grandparents? Tell us what you know.
Just figuring out what they know
Yeah.
first and then going off of that.
So you get over that hump, and then some of the records, more recent vital records, aren't available to us. I can't, in most states, I can't just go out and get somebody's birth certificate.
yeah.
know,
They're going to
some
be like, why'd you want that?
Some states you can. Connecticut, they're open, and a few states you can get over that hump. But for the most part, you have to get over a certain hump where we don't have a lot of vital records easily accessible to us. The 1950 census is the most recent census we have. So once we get people on the 1950, 1940 census, we just take it from there. We follow the paper trail where it goes. Occasionally we have a mystery where somebody's father's unknown or somebody was adopted. And our guests test DNA. And we have DNA specialists, genealogists who specialize in using that DNA in the public database to see, well, who do you match DNA with? And can we identify who their families are? And you start triangulating it. It becomes, it's a sleuthing project to try to put all of those pieces together. But eventually, we have to wrap up the research. After we identify the ancestors of a guest, who we can't choose. You can't choose who your grandparents were.
Right.
They are who they are. We now have these people, this pool of people to choose from. We do deep dives, look for newspapers in the counties where they lived, whatever records we could find, arrival records, ship manifests.
So you can tell them details about
exactly.
their removed ancestors.
And so then these are the records that allow us to pick facts and details out to tell a story that's hopefully worthy to be on television. And sometimes we don't actually have a lot of material to work with, and so historical context comes into play. And you can weave a story around relatively few documents sometimes. Other times, Edward Norton was a great one. He had an ancestor in Montana during the late 1800s.
Man, that's so cool.
I think like his second or third great-grandfather, Seneca Hughes Norton, was in the cavalry in the 1870s.
That's so amazing.
But we had the opposite problem with Edward Norton, where he knew a lot about his family already, and his family tree was just so enormous because they were just well documented. The hard thing there, the challenge was finding ancestors.
Something he didn't know.
Yeah, ancestors he had never heard of before, stories that he didn't already know. So it's always a challenge because every person's unique, everybody's family's unique. And so really we go into it not knowing what we're going to find and where it's going to lead. So that's kind of the challenge and the fun of the projects I get to work on for Finding Your Roots.
And when you're looking through all these facts and looking at the documents, and then you come across something that's just like, whoa, we have to tell them about that. Like, what's the most surprising one that you've gotten?
At the time, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I thought, I had this epiphany. But I was looking up Questlove, the band leader for The Roots, the band for The Tonight Show.
Yeah.
I was looking up some of his ancestors. They came from Mobile, Alabama. And in the 1870, 1880 censuses, I noticed that said they were born in Africa. And these are, black people, former slaves. But they were born long after the international slave trade was abolished. So U.S. law passed, I believe it was 1808, abolished the international slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade.
You were one of the last to do so,
it was,
too.
Yeah, it was illegal to transport slaves to America. So how could these people be born in Africa?
Yeah.
And, I thought, maybe it's a fluke. So, one census, I look at another census. Nope, they all say born in Africa. And I look up and down the page. A lot of their neighbors are born in Africa. And the pages before and the pages after, I'm like, this is a
centuries-old crime.
This is a old, this is a whole neighborhood. And then it dawned on me. I just remembered. I'm like, wait a minute. There was a community just north of Mobile. It was, Africa Town, and what was that? And I had to look it up, and I couldn't remember the name of the ship immediately. I'm like, the Clotilda, and it's the last known slave ship. And it was, they were smuggling slaves. And they crossed the Atlantic and brought 160-some slaves, I believe, to Mobile in 1859. This is right before the Civil War starts, And some of them would have been even children.
It's not as far removed as I thought it was.
Young adults. But it's the last known slave ship. And we were able to, tell this amazing story. It's the only time I know of that we've been able to actually name the ship,
Yeah.
the slave ship that brought ancestors to America.
I think that was such a pivotal part of history, too.
And so that was amazing. And then, like a third cousin who still lived in Alabama happened to have a portrait of the ancestor, Charles Lewis, who was born in Africa. And so we got to show Questlove, this picture. And of course, it's emotional to him. He's looking at the face of the man, his African ancestor, who was brought to America in chains to be a slave for life. And that didn't happen because of the Civil War and emancipation. He ends up living as a free man for decades after the Civil War. But anybody watching the show, you can see the family resemblance. You see, whoa, that's where you can see the eyes and the brow line, and you see this family resemblance. And so, it was moving for him, and it's moving for other people because you're experiencing that with him, but also you can just see the resemblance, and you're like, there's no doubt.
What an impactful and emotional experience to experience with him, and then also just to share with the world. And that would have been one of my favorite guests to have, ever, if that was me. But can you think of any other just favorite guests that you've had in general?
Last season that aired last January, we had Joe Manganiello, and his father's side of the family, it was all Sicilian, Italian research, and we'd actually done it and gotten back to immigrants, passed it off to an Italian researcher in Sicily, and we thought we were done. And then, lo and behold, DNA was telling us that he didn't match DNA with his paternal grandfather's relatives. And a quarter of the family tree gets thrown out the window. We end up having a DNA mystery, and we're flying by the seat of our pants. No idea where it would lead, and you can't anticipate the result, because it turns out that Joe Manganiello's grandfather was African American, mixed race, but we were able to put the pieces together, and through DNA and just an amazing collaborative effort with the team, pulled several rabbits out of our hat to document his family line back to a black patriot, Plato Turner, who was a veteran of the American Revolution in Massachusetts.
That's a good one. Yeah.
We could not have imagined or anticipated that that's the story we're going to tell. But Joe Manganiello's mother's side of the family, very interesting as well. He had some ancestors who came from what's now Croatia. We ended up not focusing on them because he had a family mystery. He had Armenian ancestry, and the Armenian genocide, one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, along with the Jewish Holocaust. His grandmother, great-grandmother, experienced that. His grandmother was born during that period, and her father was reportedly a German soldier. And again, DNA mystery, and by hook and crook and just sheer luck in some cases, somebody happened to test where we were able to put some pieces together, and they identified the guy, and we were able to document his family tree back in Germany, I think to the 1500s. The German records are great.
Oh my gosh.
Once you make that connection and you identify where the people lived, and you can look in that parish, that town, the German church records, the Lutheran records especially, are, they're just fantastic. And so you connect a few dots, and then you just kind of plug in, and we had a couple German genealogists, just take the families back as far as we could. But, he's a great example of we didn't know whether we could do it.
Yeah.
And then also, here's a mystery we didn't know existed, and it ends up. My goodness,
you pulled through, and there you are with this wonderful story.
You get a story that you would never have guessed. That
Exactly.
this is the story we're going to tell. So
I guess us here at home, we don't have access to a world-renowned field of researchers and DNA testing. But what are some ways? Do you have any advice for our listeners about researching your own family history, getting into your own genealogy?
Well, another question I get asked along the same vein is, what records and databases do I have access to that the general public doesn't? And the answer is none. Everybody, all of the resources we use are open to the public. And I also get asked, well, there's some of these restrictive rules where you can't get vital records, within 110 years in England or Canada or somewhere. How do you get around that? And the answer is we don't. And, those restrictions and those privacy laws are in place. We don't get around those. And so the records that we access for Finding Your Roots, that allows us to document family trees and tell these stories, same records, same repositories, same databases, same websites that anybody can access. And there's a number of websites for subscriptions. You can subscribe to Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, newspapers.com, Newspaper Archives. If you want to test your DNA, there's 23andMe, Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. And these are all accessible to the general public. If you want to get into family history research, the first thing I suggest people do is talk to your relatives. If you have grandparents living,
it's good advice.
cross your fingers. If you have great-grandparents living, talk to them. Yeah. Maybe, my grandpa Carl died when I was in high school. I knew him well. I had a great relationship with him. But I didn't get to hear all of the family stories that I did, say, from my great-granddad on my mom's side, who lived to be 100. And I was 26 when he died. But when I was in college, I would go and visit my granddad's brothers, my Uncle Gale, who was a little younger, and my Uncle Forrest, who was a little older. And Uncle Forrest lived over in Northport, Washington, north of Spokane. And so when I would go from Montana to Oregon to go to college, I'd swing by and see him every trip. And I ended up getting lots of stories. And one of the stories he told me was, well, my granddad, your great-great-granddad, built the western end of the High Line. So I didn't know this when we lived in Big Fork.
And I dropped this life-changing story on you.
And even they say that, the High Line, and I'm a kid, and I'm, what's the High Line? I'm like, oh, wait, the High Line? You mean like the railroad? And, it took years later that I kind of figured it out because it didn't make sense to me. That branch of my family ended up in Washington Territory by 1889. Well, that was around the time that the High Line was being built. And I knew they weren't here. But in the early days, Great Northern Railway's main line came over Marias Pass, down through what's now West Glacier. The park didn't exist. And when it came to Columbia Falls, it turned down. There is still a railway line that goes to Kalispell. That used to be the main line. And from there it went west through Marion, over the hill to Libby. Well, that hill was a hard pull for the trains. They had to have an extra siding, an extra engine or two to help the trains get over the hill. So in 1903, 1904, they decided they were going to change where the main line goes. And instead, the line goes now where it does, from Columbia Falls out through Whitefish. Whitefish didn't exist yet. The town sprang up after the railroad came through. And from there, it went up to Eureka and down the Kootenai River. Well, in the 1950s, when they built the dam in Kootenai, that part of the line had to be rerouted again and to get to Libby. But it turns out that my great-great-grandfather, Robert Herman Sheedy, would have been one of the supervisors to build the grade, and he was a bridge guy, so I'm sure he was, supervising bridge construction for the line from Columbia Falls to Whitefish and on up to Eureka. Well, I hear the whistle blow when it crosses Half Moon Road. Yeah. I mean, the line's like a quarter mile from my house. I can't complain.
Yeah, but we're going to hear it, yeah.
Hear the trains go through, because my people put the track where it is. But I didn't know at the time that I had that connection. I had an inkling that we had some connection to Great Northern Railway because my dad and my granddad had a stool. It was a heavy cast iron stool that said Great Northern Railway on it. And they said, oh, Grandpa Bompy, my great-grandfather, his dad worked for Great Northern Railway. All right. Well, I did find, not too long ago, a year or two ago, a newspaper article in the Kalispell Bee from 1904, and it's like, the new Great Northern Main Line is to be completed, and the depot's being sited at this new town site that's being platted, Whitefish. And it said that the guy in charge of it, Mr. Shepard, I think was his name, was to be named the division roadmaster for the Kalispell division. And it said R.H. Sheedy is to be named the division roadmaster for the Spokane division. they were already out
Yeah.
in the Spokane area. He had worked for Spokane Falls and Northern Railway, which Great Northern owned. And so here I have some corroborating evidence that he's associated with the guys that are associated with building the line. And so it was really cool to find that. And then I found an obituary for him when he died in the 1920s. He'd retired in 1920 and then moved to Los Angeles because some of his kids were down in Southern California, but described him as a pioneer railroader and mentioned some of the projects and some of the guys he'd worked with. So I was like, wow, that's so, it's cool.
It really is.
Yeah, but to have that personal connection. And so, my kids know that. And they know we have some railroading history. And he built railroads in Washington. Starting during territorial days, he built some of the pioneer railroads on the Olympic Peninsula and then out of Spokane and into British Columbia. But then to have this connection into Montana, and he would have come into, Montana occasionally. And the other thing my granduncle Forey told me was that he had something to do with deciding where the lodges went when Glacier Park was to be created.
Yeah.
And Great Northern wanted to build these lodges. And I never found any evidence to support it, but you can imagine they might get some of those division roadmasters together to go kick some rocks around and where's a good place to put
it?
Where's a good place to put the siding, which is going to determine where the depots go. They wouldn't have been choosing the locations for the lodges themselves.
Yeah.
But, the lodges needed depots for the train passengers to unload to get to the lodges.
Yeah.
And so, there's work that goes into that. So anyway, it's possible, and I have a family story that I had some connection to that. And then I got an old family photo album from my great-granddad's brother's granddaughter. Doesn't have children, and she's sent me this photo album from Uncle Herman, and there's photos of him in Glacier Park in 1912 on his honeymoon.
So obviously you have a deep connection to this community. He literally helped, his family helped build the railroad. So thanks, Sheedy family, for having the lovely railroad bell ring.
But as a kid, when I was in high school and college, I did not know that.
Yeah.
So knowing that now, and also making sure that my kids know that, it helps ground them, and you have a connection to a place. And of course, this isn't the only place I have a connection to.
Right.
I had ancestors all over. That's just one.
And you're making your own history as you go along too.
But it puts things into context for people. It helps people understand where they came from, and you can choose to embrace it. You can choose to ignore it, but hopefully it helps inform you. And by being better informed how we got to where we are, you can maybe make better decisions about where we're going.
Better effector in the future, because you are actively creating these stories that people are going to tell about you for years to come. So make it a good impact, please. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you guys remember, one of our big goals for this was to connect our school to the community by talking about events and by especially highlighting members of our community who have accomplished amazing things. And you still are, and your ancestors did. So this is great. He's adding to the community day by day. So just thank you so much for talking with us.
It was my pleasure. Loved being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for talking with us. We'll link some of the episodes of Finding Your Roots below, if that's all right. And you definitely should check those out and see what it's all about.
Yes.
They'll definitely make you think about your own family history.
And we can also link some of the sites that Nick mentioned below about 23andMe and Ancestry in case you wanted to check that out and see if you wanted to get into your own genealogy. So anyway, as always, have a great day.
And
go Wildcats.